Johanna, I'd like you to, if you could, track for us a little bit the route that took you to the point where you decided to become an artist, most specifically, I guess, a performing artist. Just kind of curious about the route that led you to that point.
I think, there were probably precursors in my kind of high school life. But I was always really interested in the arts, in art, but I couldn't draw. And I remember I was the only person in my high school class who took art because that was kind of for the losers.
Okay.
And in high school I was not one yet. But I went, and the teacher allowed me to write an essay instead of drawing and still get a credit. But then I went to Oberlin College, and I tried to take art, and I was not very good at it. But Oberlin had something a couple of years into my school career there called the winter term, which was a kind of a January was a concentrated month of doing something, and they had visiting artists, and in this case it was the Grand Union. That was Yvonne Rainer, Steve Paxton, David Gordon, Barbara Dilley, Nancy Green, who were all artists or had been dancers. Yvonne Rainer was by this time already making films. And Steve Paxton was inventing contact improvisation at that time. So they were all really examining dance in that kind of conceptual framework, moving out of dance into other territories and doing task-based performance stuff. And, I felt that was something that I was really interested in and could do. Because they were all dancers, I, at that point, quite deliberately decided that I would train as a dancer, but with the intention of rejecting dance.
And so you're a dancer, or at least you're a trained dancer. And from that point, how did you make the conceptual leap beyond dance?
I think it was a combination of conceptual art, minimalism in music and dance. Dance really examining what it meant to be a physical body and not so much choreography or I have to get back to the question of choreography because that's a whole other question, but the purpose of dance, the underlying ideas of physical bodies moving in space, and feminism. So that it was very clear that there were certain narratives that were embodied by the female body that needed to be, kind of unpacked and examined. So it became really interesting to me how the gendered nature of physical, that sounds absurd, of course, physical bodies are gendered, but in a different way, having to do with performance, having to do with the performing body, in which, like the he in language, the male body was the kind of neutral body and the female body was always female. So I think that pathway from dance, for instance, to the clichés, where we actually were coming at gender performance through choreography. And then that has carried on for me to even the minutiae of choreography, like lip sync, where you're just, in a sense, choreographing the face. You might think of that. but now recently, I think there's been a big return to the idea of choreography, of looking at large swaths of social engagement as a kind of choreography. And I think it's something that the art world, or museums or galleries in particular, are looking at right now, trying to, as art institutions are trying to figure out a way to re-engage the public. This notion of choreography, I think, has become really useful. This is just kind of based on my recent experiences at the AGO, but which is why I'm thinking about it now. I'm not sure that this is conscious, but there's something about dance that is really attracting the museum gallery discourse right now.
Johanna, you mentioned the clichettes a few minutes ago. I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about the clichettes, because it seems to have been a formative point in your career. You want to just track that?
We were all dancers from that same period, we might call it now, which was postmodern dance in Toronto in the late 70s. Janice Ladke, Louise Garfield, Elizabeth Chitty, and myself were very... I think we were coming at it from slightly different, from 4 individual places, but it had to do with popular choreography as opposed to, low culture as opposed to high art. An interest in that vernacular forms, coupled with, a desire, like everybody, to be a rock star at that point, but, tongue in cheek. Since we didn't play instruments or sing. So we, just adopted lip sync as a medium by which we could perform. And it was, very much about gender performance in the late 70s. So in that sense, and I was thinking about this earlier, in that sense, a kind of precursor to the theories around gender performance. Butler was not until later in the 80s, right? So, we performed together from 78 to 91, 12 years. Elizabeth performed with us for the first about year or so, and then she just thought we were too silly, I think. And we, which we were deliberately, extremely silly, sarcastic, ironic, and doing everything wrong in that sense. That was the whole period of, in performance and performance art, which was to the anti-spectacular, Yvonne Rayner's famous no manifesto, no to the spectacle, no to the extended body, no to this, and we, we're going like, yes to wigs, and yes to costumes, and yes to being absurd and ridiculous and monstrous, and all of the things that women were not supposed to be, so it was very much about popular culture's reinforcement of gender norms and stereotypes, and a feminist project, I would say. Yeah.
And what was the period that the clichettes were operating in?
So 78 to 91. Yeah, 12 years, 5 feature-length productions. We started simply as the Clichettes, just performing lip-sync numbers, but were quickly understood that we needed to contextualize the performances of the Clichettes in, to frame them somehow. We were not interested in being a kind of cover band or nostalgia act. and framed ourselves as anti-nostalgia, in fact. So that's when we started to work with the writer Marnie Jackson, and then later with Kate Lushington and others to write, several more theatrical productions. So this was another problem vis-a-vis performance art, because of course we ended up performing in theaters. But within the, I even hesitate to call them plays. I always call them productions, but I suppose they were plays. Now we might say that. We were never ourselves. We were always the clichés. So it was kind of like a performance within a play of the clichés.
There's a couple of things that your discussion of the clichés brings to mind. One of them is the question of collaboration, and I'm interested about this history of dance, because dance surely must be collaborative, at least by and large, and with the clichés, clearly there's collaboration there. And I've noticed that, of course, a lot of your practices over the last several decades have involved collaborations. I wonder if you could speak to that notion of collaboration.
I think all of my work involves collaboration, actually. I can't think of many things I have made completely by myself. I'm not that interested in my own ideas. I mean, ideas are free. They're out there, they're circulating around. I just find it much more interesting to work with someone else on a project and see how our ideas intersect and bounce off each other, and when we both go, that's it. I find working solo a little boring. Or I don't know. I always need somebody else to give me a reason to keep doing what I'm doing. And I guess my own volition isn't enough to keep me doing that. That sounds horrible.
It sounds surprising, and I'm not sure about that, but I'm interested by the implication, which is what you've just been saying, which is that the question of originality, which is so often seen as the basis upon which an artist rests their practice or their reputation even, the question of originality, as you talk about collaboration, would seem to be much more fraught than the notion of the single artist and their, I don't know, standalone ideas or something. So what is it about the collaborative process that actually does generate original ideas, I suppose, a sense of originality?
Well, I actually think that a lot of my work is about exactly that, which is questioning originality. Certainly lip sync would question originality, because what is that? What is that form even? What's going on? What is operating when somebody is mouthing someone else's words and yet experiencing or creating a completely different affect from the original? So you've got these two emotional registers happening simultaneously. So from that basis, and then also I think what's original about the human body? We've all got one. Maybe there's that, but then because of this, taking this kind of almost comedic lip sync idea, and then thinking about how emotions and ideas, especially ideas around popular culture that I was talking about earlier, are imposed on or embodied, I became really interested in how ideas move through bodies. How ideas, political ideas, emotional ideas, just ideas in general. So So that is actually, I guess, one would say a kind of study of originality. Yeah. So that question of being original, I just decided to run in the opposite direction, you know, and re-perform things and, you know, re-inhabit spaces that have already been occupied by, you know, much more famous people. And so I don't know that the collaborative process is about attacking that as much as the kind of subject matter or content or whatever else that I'm attacking collaboratively with whoever I'm working with.
The other matter that seems to come up with the clichés is the question of well, what can an artist do? What does an artist do? In fact, in the clichés, and I think in your work as a whole, correct me if I'm wrong, there's a sense of misbehaving, of exaggerating, in fact, misbehavior. And I wonder if the transgressive impulse that would seem to suggest for you remains perhaps one of the primary tasks that an artist can perform.
I would say yes for me. I'm not sure about artists in general. But I do think that missing that prefix, whether it's misidentify or misexpress or misappropriate or all of those kinds of misses, I think are probably part of the artist's domain. And misbehavior, of course, is part of the performance artist domain because it is about behavior. Or as Schechner put it, twice behaved behavior.
Oh, do you want to explore that?
This is Richard Schechner's, of course he's talking more about drama in general, or I think theater in general, to say that, but performance is twice behaved behavior. So when one is behaving according to a text or a pre-existing...
I'm reminded of Andy Warhol's famous interview when he turned to his interviewer and said, tell me what to say, I'll say anything.
Yeah. That's the way I feel right now. Just tell me what to say. And
I'll refrain.
Maybe you can. I'll just lip sync it.
I should have prepared a choreography. You've performed, in fact, a number of times, I think, with Francis Leamy. Mm-hmm. What's special about that particular collaboration?
Well, Francis and I met when we were both at York, and when I came to Canada, I went to York University to finish my degree in dance, and she was there in the visual arts, and of course I had friends in the dance world, but my real colleagues and peers were in the visual arts department because I was hiding out in the dance department as a visual artist or as an artist. So so that maybe comes back to maybe a second, I was talking about Yvonne Rainer and the Grand Union and that influence of performance. So the proponent of performance art at York at that time was George Magnapelli and Eugene Tellez and others in that circle. So Francis and I both became, were kind of part of that group of people who were interested in making performances and bringing other elements into visual artwork. And there were others doing it as well. I mean, Vera Frankel was there at the same time, Eileen Thallenberg, other people were at York at that time who were also taking up performative strategies, I guess. We could say that. there was a pretty, very progressive music department, that was really interested in pushing the boundaries of music as well as dance. The theater department was still kind of, it seemed to me, stuck in the 60s, but so not so much to do with them, but yeah. Yeah, so Frances and I began working there, and I think we both, we were kind of, I think we bonded around the fact, if I can say that, connected around the fact that we were both cute girls, and really rankled against that unfortunate set of genetic happenstance, because it's very hard to be taken seriously. And we wanted to be taken seriously, but we were conveniently, always could take off your clothes or put on an apron or, So, yeah, I think we were interested in kind of, again, in a slightly different way and a more serious, although it was often humorous as well, than the clichettes. I mean, the clichettes were kind of over the top about it. Frances and I think, were trying to work through less narrative ideas. Yeah. Yeah, because the clichettes developed into a kind of, narrative practices, right? We had plays with plots, whereas Frances and my performance didn't have a plot per se, but was more about exploring a series of images and ideas and materials. Yeah.
What brought you to York?
The dance department. I was studying dance at the London School of Contemporary Dance in England. And Grant Strati, who had founded the dance department at York, was advising the London School of Contemporary Dance on starting a university dance program. And at that point, I guess my kind of, my patience with London was running out or something. I just felt like I'd been there for a few years and I had to leave and wanted to go somewhere else. I had the opportunity to finish my degree, so that seemed quite simple. So, yeah, it was just that. And Grant said, "Yeah, come to York." He auditioned me at the London School and said, "Yeah, come." So I got on a plane and came, sight unseen. Somebody on the plane said, "Oh, you can apply for landed immigrant status once you get here. It's really easy." So I call myself the last of the draft dodgers in some ways, because there was that wave of people, of artists who came connected with the anti-Vietnam immigration, which my own immigration to England was connected to. So I had left the United States when Nixon was elected for the second time. I said to myself, this country is going in the wrong direction. And recent events have proved me horribly right. Yeah, so I decided, my choice was to continue to dance, and to work would be to do the studio route in New York, which I wasn't particularly interested in returning to the United States at that point. And Canada had garnered a reputation for being welcoming of immigrants, and especially political immigrants. So if that's not too overblown to say that I was that, but yeah.
You said, you talked a little bit earlier about framing the clichettes. Do you see a particular frame around your post-clichette productions, Johanna?
No. Particular frame. Give me an example of a frame.
Well, I guess we've put it already, feminism, and misbehaving. A way of understanding how one would define the practice that you've developed, well, through a number of course, quite different works, but whether there's a thread that you find yourself coming back to when you're planning a new work or thinking about the work that you've done, is there a particular way, in fact, in which you frame or you see that work developing a position?
No, I think I do that retroactively.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think I don't think that's something that comes to mind. You know, I never say, oh, I'm going to make a feminist work. I just look back and I go like, wow, I made another feminist work. Isn't that interesting? You know, I didn't mean to. Yeah, so I think that's a retroactive thing, actually. The frame. For me, I just keep trying to follow is what interests me or what interests or what I find interesting in the person that I want to collaborate with.
I wonder if you'd talk a little bit about one of the more recent works, and We Did Everything an Adult Would Do. Where did we go wrong? What went wrong? Mm-hmm. Do you want to talk a bit about that work in terms
well,
of...
that, We Did Everything Adults Would Do, What Went Wrong, which is a misquote. We found out later, retroactively. That came out of, I had started independently. I do work independently sometimes, but then, so this had come out of the series that I did of videos that I made with BHL called Approximations, in which we were looking at kind of synecdotal filmic moments, you know, in the, whatever, what can I call it, late modern history of cinema. And, you know, we had done Apocalypse Now and 2001 A Space Odyssey and Last Tango in Paris and The Passion of the Christ. And yeah, I was working on another project, and I was, for some reason, Lord of the Flies kept cropping up kind of in my imaginary cupboard. I think it was actually the crash of you know, the big world economic meltdown in 2008, 2009. And I had been thinking about Lord of the Flies, and then I was thinking about how, you know, those boys were rescued. You know, my kind of imaginary narrative was that they had learned everything on the island, and then when they were rescued, went back and continued their career in private school or public school, and became bankers, and essentially were responsible for the world economic collapse because they had learned the dog-eat-dog world of finance on the island in Lord of the Flies. Anyway, that was kind of, so I was trying to figure out how I was going to work with that material. And yeah, so I was in the process. I tried a few things, some photo shoots, you know, I talked to people about being Piggy or being Ralph or, you know, other people. And Frances had just bought her house in the country, and she was like everybody who buys a house in the country. They think, what am I going to do with this house in the country? I guess I'll have an artist residency. And so she invited, you know, 3 of us to join her for a long weekend and share our recent work and recent projects. And she was working on Shirley Temple. You know, Frances makes these wonderful kind of collage films, drawing on kind of period Life magazine imagery, and she'd been really interested in Shirley Temple and had done some research on her and had centered in on the film Wee Willie Winkie. So she was doing that, I was doing Lord of the Flies, and I did some experimental film shoots with her and some of the other people who were at the residency. And then we just began working in parallel. You know, we kind of identified that there was a conversation between these 2 characters, Shirley as Winky, she's in the middle of a conflict, which in fact turns out to be in Afghanistan, although that's not really spelled out in the film. And here's Piggy, stuck in this conflictual situation, and it just seemed that those two figures resonated with each other and maybe had something to say to each other, or had parallel observations about being children in conflict situations. So it really developed out of that. And then it grew, so we began working with the footage of the two films, Lord of the Flies and Wee Willie Winkie. And then had this idea of again, it's kind of a retrograde, looking at doing the research after you make the work. So, but some of that research was so interesting that we decided to, turn that into the exhibition.
Right. Installation.
The installation, yeah.
Just briefly, I wonder if you'd come back to one of the pieces in approximations that you did with Yael, that about 2001, The Space Odyssey. Do you want to describe a little bit that work, because it's somewhat different from what went wrong. There's a very material sense of your own performativity. You want to talk about that?
Somebody called me a ham, actually, and I'm just like, I don't know, maybe I am. I found it insulting to be called a ham.
Well, it's an exaggeration, and perhaps exaggeration is one of your tropes. So.
But I didn't mean to be a ham. So we had done Apocalypse Now, which was an idea that I had for a long time, and Yael, bless her heart, said, well, let's just shoot it, So we did, and it was shot for shot, edited in camera. And then we thought, we were very happy with the way it had turned out. So about a year later, we started to think of, we're gonna, we'll remake all of cinema. So what's next? And it was, there was the big, 1999 Y2K situation. So we started to think about 2001. And Yael was adamant that we actually shoot it in 2000, that we get it done before 2001. So we actually shot it, and this is the title of the work, December 31st, 2000. So, and in thinking about how we were going to shoot it, of course it's December in Toronto, it has to be inside. And we realized that we could kind of remap this idea of choreography, remap the spaceship onto this house, going through the pod bay doors, and, which turns out to be the refrigerator, and into the oven. And it was, of course, this is kind of would look like a semiotics of the kitchen, blatant feminist, but that was not really the idea. The idea was, here are these, big, thick, heavy doors that I'm opening and crawling in through these openings. And then when it turns out to be the refrigerator and this oven and the washing machine, that's the technology that is the technology of the future that we have, that was promised to us in 2001, is not interplanetary space travel, but French door refrigerators. It's this failure of the future to deliver something, lifting humanity forward in an evolutionary way, but actually it's just this trap of the ideology of consumerism, I guess. is the way I see it right now. That it really had to do with the failure of the future that we were promised, or that we thought we had been promised.
You don't, I may be putting words in your mouth, but you don't theorize the work. You use theory more as a post-production check, perhaps. We have behind you, however, a piece called On the Subject of Art, and that elicits the thought about theory. Now, I know that you teach, so theory must enter into your equation somehow, but I'm kind of curious in thinking about this particular work, to what extent theory does play a role, albeit in post-production.
Well, in this particular work, there are a couple of things going on. 3 or 4. A few things. So, interestingly, I came across this lecture by Alain Badiou. I was at a conference, and he, as a philosopher, had been taken up as a kind of go-to theorist around performance, and I wasn't familiar with his work, but at the time, because he was one of the philosophers who was really talking about the constitution of the subject. You know, how is the subject produced? It is a trace of the body in the world, but then I found this lecture that he'd given at Deitch Projects in New York, and I was completely taken with Josefina Ayerza, the editor of Lacanian Inc., who introduces him, and of course they're sharing the dais. So as he performs his philosophy, and I guess I had been thinking a lot about the performance of academic, theorization, which is always performed on a dais, often in a panel situation or a, visiting lecture or whatever. So I was interested in that performance of academic thought. And this particular example, I was really mesmerized by her performance of listening. So there were these kind of equally profound performances, one of academic theory and thought, philosophy, to a room full of an audience, full of fans, perhaps, and then her performance of listening, which kind of contextualized it, because she is the editor of Lacanian Inc., in kind of Freudian terms for me, which was also very fun. Freud is so much fun. So, so I'm still interested in how ideas are embodied. How ideas, convey themselves around the world inside people's heads, right? It's this, and how a lot of that is invisible to us, on a daily basis. Our relationship to each other's ideas, I think. So theory in general, I think is important, but for me, theory is actually a form of fiction. So, I just think writing in general, theory is important and can help students in particular, or me, understand the kinds of pressures and affordances that are happening within or around a work, but I guess I don't think about theory when I'm making something necessarily, except in a really kind of sketchy way. It's useful though.
I'm kind of curious to go from there to a question that emerges as I hear you speak. much of the work has rested on a sense of transgression or a sense of uh, comedy, I guess. And I'm kind of curious as to what you think, how you feel about working from that mode in contemporary culture, which, correct me if you think I'm wrong, but would seem to have withdrawn its support from certainly classic feminism, from perhaps comedy itself, since the news is filled with horrific things happening around the world, and perhaps the election recently in the United States would seem to be part of that. In any case, it seems to be, for many people, it's a moment of anxiety and fear that seems to have stripped itself of the ability to find comedy and the ability to challenge conventional ideas. How do you feel about working in the mode that you do, given that, for me, would seem to be the context that we are entering into?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's hard for me to actually identify the mode that I work in, but when you first started to ask the question about transgression, and then I thought, the real transgressive thing in the art world is to be entertaining. And recently there was an artist here that we had brought for the 7A 11D Performance Festival, Joseph Ravens from Chicago. And when he was trying to get a license for his gallery performance space in Chicago, Defibrillator, they wanted to license it as adult entertainment business, because that's the closest approximation they could find. And he said, I don't know which was more insulting, the adult or the entertainment, as a venue for performance art. So I don't, humor, entertainment, comedy, satire, I don't think it's almost inconceivable that I could say this, but I don't think we really thought of the cliches even as being hilarious or as being comedic. It was much more about satire. And I just kind of given myself over to the fact that I can't help it. I can't help but try to find the humor in the thing that's happening. And maybe, and again, I think that's a kind of accident of birth. Of course, it's completely absurd for me, little old embodied me, to kind of be this great French philosopher, I mean, it's ridiculous. So that ridiculousness is maybe more than comedy, is kind of what I guess I would thread through. I do think, though, that, I've taken refuge in the idea that it's actually Alec Baldwin who is now president or elect, that humor in that sense is the only thing that's going to get us through the next few years, and it won't always succeed. It doesn't always succeed. It's very, it's stylistic. I think it's vulnerable to different time periods, so it can become dated really quickly, I think.
I wonder if, as you say that, I think to myself, well, it may be that we live in uncertain and frightening times, but perhaps this is the moment at which irony, satire, parody, comedy in all of its manifestations becomes the most acute definition of an era. Any thoughts about that?
I hope that's true. I really hope that's true. I love all of those things. I love parody. comedies. Maybe not comedy so much. Comedy qua comedy. I like the kind of nuance, the more pointed. I've never been a big fan of slapstick, for instance. Much more along the lines of impersonation and lampoon and, a bit of bite. Yeah. As to that question of withdrawing support for feminism, makes it all the more compelling. Although it seems really, as I was talking earlier, for me to say, oh, I made another feminist work. I mean, that even, to me, sounds kind of retro. So perhaps there's a new language that needs to be developed around the particular sensibility and circumstances, based on the circumstances that women as opposed to men, and I would include, all genders in those two, find themselves disadvantaged. Still, I mean, you just have to look at the Trumpiverse to see, utterly masculine view of the world. I'm sorry to have to say that to you, Ian.
Maybe that's why I didn't like the masculine world much. How important a general audience is for you. I don't know exactly what a general audience is.
I don't either. I don't know what a general audience is. Audience is important. The size of the audience, not important. From 6 to 60, as they used to say. From 6 to 6,000, or size in that case does not matter. It really is. It's a work that, of course, performance counts on an audience, but the size of that audience, I think, is kind of immaterial.
Audience. On the question of audience, then, of course, the audience that we most specifically seek out, certainly the one that we most certainly invite, is critical response, whether it be through a curator or through a professional critic. And I take note of the fact that other artists also write, so I suppose we can include artist writers as well. What sense do you have of the response that you would prefer to hear back from that critical response? How do you see the work functioning to an audience of that nature?
Well, I like it when people get it. I haven't, quite honestly, had a vast amount of critical response, particularly from the, art magazine world, journals. I think now, perhaps, the clichettes might have gotten some response from those quarters, but at the time it was almost always entertainment theater journalists, so they're looking at it as theater. I'm not exactly sure what the question is about. Like, how would I like people to write about my work? I mean, that's kind of completely out of my thought processes, I think. It's that, I don't know why I keep quoting people like Schechner or Barnett Newman, but it's like, I paint so I have something to look at, I mean, I do think that artists make things because they are addressing themselves first and foremost. Like this, what do I think? What do I think about this? Well, I'll do this, and then it will reflect back to me what I think. So I think there's that process that happens. But that's not to say that, the kind of spectrum of critical discourse is extremely important, you know. But whether it's addressing my work particularly doesn't concern me one way or the other.
Johanna, you've taught for a long time at this point. And I suppose if we were to segue from critical response to the responses that you have in the academy, the classroom, I'm kind of curious how you feel about those years of teaching, how you like teaching, to what extent you find teaching and your practice as a professional artist symbiotic.
It's interesting because I just finished teaching a class, the third year performance class, that was pretty much a disaster. And I can also reflect back on other periods when, you know, because I've been teaching for about 20, maybe over 25 years, where, you know, feminist work was completely out of fashion with the young women artists that are, you know, they just didn't want to know. So those things kind of ebb and flow. And I think for me, the real attraction with teaching is really about the discourse that we're talking about, you know, that we were talking about earlier, whether it takes place in writing or in conversation in the classroom. It's really about the conversation about art in general and its function, how it can operate as a philosophical pursuit, as much as a, you know, kind of material, you know, and now unfortunately very, you know, kind of career motivated, you know, the pressures on our students now are just enormous compared to what they were 20 years ago, I think, even. Yeah, so there, you know, there are always a handful of students that one really, you know, can connect with. And I think it's also important to think about, you know, one's own relationship with one's teachers and which ones, you know, whose effect you haven't felt until, you know, 20 years later or something, and then you go, oh, that's what I learned from that, you know, that's where that comes from, you know, that's where that thought comes from, or, you know, so you know, it's probably a process of me maturing as a teacher or as a faculty member, to not worry too much about the immediate reaction to my ideas or processes, but to think that, you know, they'll sink in at some point. And vice versa, you know, I mean, it's a dialogue for me as much as me, and, you know, I feel like I'm pretty incapable of kind of imparting some kind of higher knowledge. I'm much more interested in, again, a collaboration, a mutual drawing out of strengths.
I guess teaching leads, and you just mentioned the question of competition and the difficulty of establishing a career that the students obviously are facing. I'm kind of curious, but they're headed towards what we generally call the art system. And I wonder what your views on that system are, perhaps from the perspective of teaching, perhaps from your own perspective as a working artist, how you see the art system with respect to that.
Well, I think I don't. I think performance art as a medium had as its basis a kind of rejection of a system, especially one which capitalizes on the outputs of artists. So I've been very lucky with my colleagues in the performance art world here in Toronto to be able to establish our own counter system institutions and discourse that doesn't depend on the institutions. I mean, we've made our own institutions, but they're very small institutions, you know, the Performance Festival, Fado, you know, the books, the magazines, the zines, those kinds of things. The artists run spaces. So in terms of the larger system, I'm interested in looking at that, and certainly there are artists who make wonderful work that nourishes me. But it's not where I've ever identified myself as being. I've always thought of myself as a kind of an interloper, or I don't know, fringe character.
Okay, so Clive Robertson talks about the performance, the arena performance, as an anti-task and something you might say against the system itself. Do you see it that way?
Yeah, I do, very much so. And that's that I think is what's perhaps difficult about the institution of the art school, of incorporating performance into that. Although I think many students, and I've been told this even recently, that performance for many students, they understand as being the foundation of all work. It really opens up contemporary practice to them in a way, and I think that's important. But I always have been of two minds about the institutionalization in terms of what we teach as performance, who we teach as artists in performance, and trying to open that out as broadly as possible to, you know, various kinds of strategies, whether they're, you know, whether we consider them valid or not, to say, okay, this artist is doing this, what do you think about it? Not, this is good performance art, and this is not so good, you know. To me, it's that, it's a, you know, kind of cosmology or genealogy network of, and of course Filio described it as the eternal network, you know, of artists making linkages, actually even worldwide, but yeah, so a kind of counter system where not a lot of money changes hands.
Here's a question that just occurred to me as you were speaking. Many have thought for some time that one of the foundations of contemporary art is in fact, or does lie in a performance, or at least performativity, which is strikingly different, let us say, from not the 19th century or early 20th, perhaps up until early performance work in the 20s, I suppose, or before the First World War. Do you feel, in that sense, that working in performance is in some respects core, base core, to contemporary art in general?
I think that, and I think, yeah, I was at a really interesting, Simone Forti, who is now in her 80s, but was also a very seminal artist, dance-based in the 70s particularly, and early 80s, and was one of those artists who had a book produced at NASCAD Press, you know, called Handbook in Motion. So she was dance-based, but she was a painter, and she was doing big, so I went to hear an artist talk of hers just recently in Montreal. She's, as I say, in her 80s, but still performing. And she was talking about making these big, you know, color-filled, abstract, expressionist, you know, gestural works that everybody was making, and then she would make, you know, these sweeping gestures up here, and then maybe work a little bit smaller into some other stuff down here, and then big washes over here, and then at the end she would have this big wet canvas that she had to do something with. And then she realized that she could actually make these gestures of going big over here and working something small over here and going over here, and not have to have the canvas or the paint, but just the physical presence. So that's kind of the way I think about it. That, performance anticipates the creation of an image, but the image doesn't have to be recorded, but it can be. So in that sense, all art is the record of a performance.
Right. If we talk something fundamental, something foundational, we're inevitably coming close to something that has been called authenticity, that something that is real in some respect, real in the sense it's fundamental state. I'm not sure what your views on authenticity might be with respect to performance or to the work that you do, or what it is that you might be aiming for. Do you have thoughts about that?
I don't know how to think about authenticity as different from originality. Are they different?
Well, there has been, in recent decades, as I'm sure you know, a withdrawal from originality, and perhaps collaboration is one of those strategies by which one does withdraw from originality. But nonetheless, there seems to be still something that one is hoping is there, perhaps, something that a residue of something fundamental that nonetheless has to be somehow conveyed, something beyond mere content, but something that moves the audience, perhaps, to bond with the work. I suppose authenticity is just one word that could be applied to that, and perhaps we can retire that word if it's now a bit old-fashioned, but there's in a sense, a kind of emotional bond that an artist often tries to achieve. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, I certainly have thoughts about wanting to bond with the audience, or wanting the audience to bond with the work. And those are there's a kind of triangle there, of wanting to connect. I'm not sure that I would talk about it in relationship to authenticity. There's a wonderful show right now at the power plant, which is Ito Barada's show of the faux guide, in which it examines the fake fossils coming out of Morocco. And we were lucky enough to be there with the Sunday tour was being given by a paleobiologist who specialized in trilobites. Scads of fake trilobites come out of Morocco. So the conversation got into exactly that idea about, well, if you have it and you think that it's a 3 million year old trilobite, does it matter if it really is? So there's that question around authenticity. And also we were talking about this last night, about whether Nefertiti's head was actually a copy that was sent to Rome to say, the real thing is back in Egypt, but this is a really good copy. Those kinds of things. Like, I find that really fascinating, and that's what really attracts me around the question of authenticity, which is whether do we need it? If we think something's authentic, but even if it isn't, look at all the reproductions of everything, and do we get as much pleasure from those as we would standing in front of the real thing in the Louvre or wherever? It's like, and I think the answer is yes, we do.
We can download authenticity to the viewer.
Yeah. Yes, download to the viewer. Okay, Yvonne's waving her arms. She's done. She's had enough of me.